Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. It's not often I get a chance to come to Hull. I think this is my third visit here, and so, you know, thank you very much. My story began just after the events of 9/11. And I ended up, I was the chief reporter of the Sunday Express, and I ended up in Pakistan as the war of words between Washington and the Taliban and London were escalating. It was obvious that there was going to be a war, and although the 15 of the 19 hijackers had been Saudis and the others were also Arabs, George Bush wanted to bomb Afghanistan, and he was making that quite clear. So when I was in Pakistan, there was about 3,000 journalists from around the world, and journalism can be very competitive, and I thought, what can I do that the other 2,999 won't be doing? And I had this idea to sneak into Afghanistan wearing the all-enveloping blue burqa. It's actually called the chador, but that isn't a good headline. Burqa is much better, so the Western media decided we'll call it a burqa and not a chador. So I wore this all-enveloping blue burqa with two guides, one from Pakistan, one from Afghanistan, and we sneaked into the country. And I just thought, if I can spend 2 days undercover and get a bit of an idea of what this Taliban are like, you know, it'll make quite a good story. Because George Bush and Tony Blair were saying that this was the most evil, brutal regime in the world, and they hated women. And Bush and Blair wouldn't lie to us, would they? And so while all these talks were going on, Bush wanted the Taliban to hand over bin Laden, and the Taliban were saying, give us some evidence or proof that he carried out 9/11, and we'll hand him over to a third, an independent country. They did actually at one stage offer to do that, but nobody was interested in this. You know, America was reeling, it was in pain. It had never been invaded since the English burned down the White House. You know, it was in a state of shock, and somebody had to pay, in the words of the Bushies. So it looked as though it was going to be Afghanistan. And so I thought, if I can get into Afghanistan, find out what life is like under the Taliban. And it seems crazy when I'm talking to you in Hull in the cold light of day, saying, oh yeah, I'll just go sneak into Afghanistan, but that's what I did. So I put on this all-enveloping blue burqa, and it was like putting on Harry Potter's invisible cape. As soon as I put that on, I did become invisible. Nobody took any notice of me. When we walked through a Taliban checkpoint to get into Afghanistan from Pakistan, I was a cross on somebody's travel documents. And, you know, I was so insignificant, I didn't even have my own papers. And so I was able to get into Afghanistan quite easily. And then we went to a market to the nearest city, which was Jalalabad. And I sat on the edge of the marketplace while I observed I couldn't speak the language, but I could observe life unfolding in the marketplace. and I sat there, and I noticed that all the shopping was being done by men. And I thought, well, that's quite liberating, isn't it? You know, but of course the reason for that was that women under the Taliban were not allowed to talk to a man they didn't know, and by that, somebody who they weren't related to. So if you weren't married or related in any way to a shopkeeper or a trader, it was impossible for a woman to do something as simple as buy a bag of sugar. So that's why the men were doing all the shopping. My guides got their provisions, and we went to the village of where one of the guides had been born. And of course, as soon as he arrived, there was great merriment and joy, because there was one of their own returning, plus he was armed with all sorts of goodies. And there was much joy and merriment until somebody must have said, you know, who's the woman in the burqa? And they said, she's a Western journalist. They were furious, because only that day Mullah Omar, the spiritual leader of the Taliban, had said, anyone helping a Westerner in this time of trouble will be executed. And there was this Westerner in their midst, and so I was taken away and put into this room while the villagers decided, what are we going to do about this? But you know, there's something wonderful about the Afghan people. They've got great hospitality, which is matched only by their curiosity. So very soon, a couple came in to see me, a young man and woman. And the young woman, I asked her how she felt about this impending war. And she said, I'm so angry because I was training to be a doctor, and I should be qualified by now, and if there is a war, I should be in a hospital and I should be able to help my people. And she said, I can't, because I was sent home from the college. And I said, oh yes, I heard that the Taliban didn't like to have women educated. And her brother said, no, this isn't the case. He said, I was at the same training school. I too was training to become a doctor, and the college ran out of money and they couldn't afford to pay the teachers, and in the end it closed down. He said, and that's why we're sitting now at home. And I could really feel their frustration, and as we were talking more, this Afghan woman walked in, and she looked me up and down, and she put her hands on her hips and her toes started tapping, which, you know, is international language for trouble ahead. And she said to me, and of course this was all done through a translator, she said to me, do you have any children? And I said, yes, I've got a daughter. I was very keen to get on her side because she seemed quite intimidating. And I said, yes, I've got a daughter. And she said, one child. And I said, yes. And she said, you American and English women are all the same. All you can ever manage is one, maybe two children. She said, me, I can have 15 boy soldiers. And she said, and when you can only have one or two, she said, I can have 15 and I will be having more. And I thought, gosh, this is, fighting talk, and she doesn't seem that worried that the biggest superpower in the world wants to bomb her country. And then she said, but we're very sorry about what happened to the American people. We're very sorry about this accident. And she kept referring to 9/11 through the translator as an accident. And I said to the translator, why are you saying accident? And of course, under the Taliban, television was also banned. So most people, especially in the countryside, didn't have TV sets. They didn't see the images that we saw. I mean, we had images of the Twin Towers collapsing, one of the towers being hit, and all of this. We had a day in, day out, every 15 minutes, 4 times an hour, for about 3 or 4 weeks. You know, nobody was allowed to forget, as if any of us could, what happened on 9/11. But they didn't see any of these images. All they heard was that these towers had been hit and collapsed and people had died, and they didn't see these dramatic images, so they couldn't experience the full horrors that we were, as I say, subjected to every hour, on the hour, 4 times an hour. And so she was referring to it as an accident, and she said, you know, we're very sorry about what happened to the American people, but what has it got to do with us? And I thought about this, and as I said earlier on, you know, the 19 hijackers were all Arabs. There were no Taliban on the planes, there were no Afghans on the planes. You know, what did it have to do with them? And it was very hard to try and explain why the biggest superpower in the world wanted to drop $1 million bombs on essentially $10 huts. And I said, but you must be very scared at the thought of this superpower coming into your country. And she said, dare one American soldier step foot into my village and I myself will fight him off with those pots and pans over there. And I thought she probably would, and certainly this blew away the myth that these Afghan women are all quiet, shy, timid creatures hiding under a veil. She wasn't wearing a burqa. Nobody was wearing a burqa in the village. It was just the only one wearing a burqa was me. And so it was quite eye-opening, but what I did establish was that girls were educated under the Taliban until the schools closed because of financial problems or no money to pay the teachers. So that was something interesting that I learned. As the day wore on, it was quite obvious that they were uncomfortable by my continued presence in the village, so we left and decided that we'd head back to the border, which would take some hours. But when we got there, the border had been sealed. President Pervez Musharraf, or General Pervez Musharraf, the leader of Pakistan, had decided nobody was getting in or out of Afghanistan, as the drums for war were beating ever louder. So we stayed overnight, and then the next morning the border was still closed, and one of my guides said we could go through a smuggling route. And I said, oh yes, let's do that. And I thought, this is exciting, it will give me something more to write about, and everybody will say what a terrific, courageous reporter she is, you know, going through this smuggling route. And I just imagined that we would be ducking and diving from tree to tree, going down narrow mountain passes. But in fact, the smuggling route that we took was the same smuggling route that was taken by hundreds of people. People who were leaving Afghanistan, terrified of being bombed, and while families with all of their goods in handcarts were being hauled over towards Pakistan, on the other side there were lots of young men coming over, and they wanted to join the Taliban. They wanted to fight the great Satan, as they referred to America. So there were donkey traders, camel traders, there were coffee and tea and food. It was like Piccadilly Circus. It was hugely busy and not at all what I expected. By this time my feet were being cut and bloodied by the shoes I'd been wearing, so I complained, and one of my guides said, well, we can make the final part of the journey by donkey. And he took me to this string of mangy looking animals and he said, "Can you ride a donkey?" And I said, "Can I ride a donkey?" I said, of course I can. I can ride a horse, I can gallop and jump fences. And I said, "Look at these, they're half the size and the same shape." I said, "Of course I can ride a donkey." So he just shrugged his shoulders and did some sort of deal. Quite what it was, I've no idea, because I thought, how are we going to get the donkey back? But I got onto this donkey and I'm just positioning myself in the seat when the animal just bolted. And it just hurtled through all these crowds of people, and people were scattering, and I screamed out, and my burqa was flapping in the wind, and the flapping was making the animal more scared, and it was running faster and faster. And I tried to move forward to pull the reins and get this donkey under control. And as I moved forward to try and grab the reins, the one piece of equipment that I had taken into Afghanistan, a camera banned under the Taliban, the camera popped out of the folds of my burqa right in the view of a passing Taliban soldier. He saw the camera and he started shouting. And in truth, I really can't remember if he grabbed the animal and stopped it, or if the animal just stopped by him. And one way or another, I remember that it stopped suddenly and I went up into the air and crashed to the ground. And I picked myself up and I'm looking through the grill of my burqa straight into the eyes of this Taliban soldier. And of course, when I got back to London, a few of my girlfriends had said, "What was going through your mind when you realised you'd been captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world?" And I said, well, for a nanosecond, and it was just a nanosecond, I'm looking through the grill of this burqa and I'm looking into his eyes, and I just thought, my goodness, you are gorgeous. He had the most amazing green eyes. I don't know how many of you have seen this picture made famous in the National Geographic of the Afghan woman with emerald eyes. Really, he had the same stunning emerald eyes, high cheekbones, a wild beard and a hair with just wild hair with a mind of its own. I mean, he looked quite magnificent. But as I say, this was just for a nanosecond, and then the harsh reality of having been captured by the Taliban hit me, and he was shouting at me. I didn't understand what he was saying, but I knew that he wanted the camera, so I pulled the camera off and I gave it to him, and then I stood back and closed my eyes, because I thought, I'm going to be shot now. You know, this is what brutal, evil regimes do, don't they? And so I stood there with my eyes shut for about 10 seconds, which is a long time when you're waiting to be shot. And then I opened my eyes again and he'd gone. He'd gone to see the donkey trader, because he would then find out who had hired the donkey, and he would then find out who was responsible for the camera. I was just a mere woman, and I just thought, he doesn't realise I'm a Westerner, I can get away. And we had agreed during the planning of this adventure that if things went pear-shaped, it was every man, woman for themselves. And I thought, well, things have gone pear-shaped. They don't know I'm a Westerner. I can get away. And just then, a group of people with 3 women wearing burqas at the back joined this. Went over, heading towards the Pakistan border, and so I joined them. I thought, what's one more burqa? Nobody's going to notice. I can do this. I can get away. And a couple of minutes later, as I was walking, I turned back and saw that one of the guides had been brought to account by the soldier, and he was waving the camera at his face. And I just thought, well, it's, you know, there's nothing I can do. So I continued walking And then I turned back again, and by this time the second guide had gone to try and calm the situation. A group of angry men had surrounded them, and the soldier was in the middle waving the camera angrily, and he slapped one of the guides across the face. And I just thought, there's nothing I can do, and I started to walk away, and I thought, I can't leave them. And I cursed myself, but I thought, I'm going to have to go back. And I then turned back and walked towards this crowd of angry men. And as I got close, I tried to push my way in, and this man sort of looked at me and you know, what's this woman doing? And he threw me back. This was man's business. It was nothing to do with a woman. So I braced myself again and tried to push through the crowd again, and again I was thrown back. And I thought, gosh, what do you have to do to try and rescue somebody around here? So in the end, I took off my burqa. I was wearing a shalwar kameez, a long dress, and a pair of trousers. And I said, will somebody let me through? And suddenly everybody stopped, and you could have heard a pin drop. They looked and thought, where has this Westerner come from? And they parted. And I walked up towards the Taliban soldier, and who by this time, rather than looking magnificent, was looking a bit gormless. His mouth was wide open, thinking, where has this Westerner come from? And I threw a quick look at my guides. I thought that they would look back in admiration and think, you know, what a noble gesture. And they looked back at me as if to say, we were in trouble before. Now we're in serious trouble. And I realized at that point this was the worst possible thing that I could have done. So I went to the soldier and demanded that he give me my camera back. And the net effect anyway was that the three of us were bundled into a car and driven off at speed. Now, it was before mobile phones really took off in Afghanistan, so I don't know how people found out, but news just spread through the district that a spy had been caught, an American spy. And very soon we had a convoy of people in Toyota pickup trucks, and they were firing their Kalashnikovs, and they were shouting Zindabad Osama, meaning long life to Mr. Bin Laden, and death to America, death to the American spy. And at one checkpoint, I rolled down the window as the crowds came, and I said, don't worry, I'm not American, I'm British. And they looked at me as if to say, and what difference does that make? At another checkpoint, this little boy came running up to the window to have a close look at this American spy, and as he squinted and he's looking through the window at me, I smiled at him and I winked, and he drew back and just shook his head gravely and went like that. And I thought, yes, he's right, this is what's going to happen to me. And then I was taken after another checkpoint. The driver and the soldier were having a row. There was something about me that had upset the driver, and he made an emergency stop. The soldier got out and he opened the door and he motioned for me to get out and pointed his gun at me, so you don't argue with somebody with a gun. So I did, and he pointed to a raised piece of ground, and he obviously wanted me to stand on it. So I stood on this raised piece of ground, and then he went off over a hill, and I'm standing there, and I'm looking around, and I looked down at my feet, and all I could see was blood red nail varnish. Somewhere in all of the melee I'd lost my socks and shoes, and nail varnish was staring up at me, and I thought, oh gosh, this is banned under the Taliban as well. If they see the colour of my toes, they'll probably chop them off one by one. So I'm trying to hide my toes in the dirt, and there was lots of rocks and pebbles and stones, and I just thought, oh no, this is the stoning corner. I'm going to be stoned. And he's gone over the hill. He's probably shouting now, saying, quick, quick, we've got a Westerner. We'll have a stoning in 10 minutes. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, yeah, this must be the stoning corner. And then after a few minutes, some men gathered round, about 40 men, and they started getting closer and closer. And I'm looking down at this crowd and they're looking back at me really angrily. And I just thought, you know, that this must be the advance party for the stoning. And I thought, I'm just going to drop on my knees and start praying. And then I thought, no, I can't do that. This isn't a Christian country. If I do that, then they'll probably start the stoning early. And then I remembered as a Sunday school teacher telling the kids how Jesus had stopped a stoning. He'd been with his disciples and he was walking and there was this woman who was about to be stoned, and he stopped the stoning. He said, let him without sin cast the first stone. And I thought, I'm going to say that. The fact that they didn't speak English and I didn't speak Pashto didn't occur to me. And I'm looking round thinking, yes, I'm going to say, let him without sin. And then I saw these 3 old men at the back with long white beards down past their bellies. And I just thought, oh, they look very pious indeed. And if I say this, they'll probably say, that's us, and they'll start the stoning early. And I'm standing there, all of this is going through my mind, and I just thought, I'm seconds away from the most violent, brutal death. And will anybody ever find out, you know, will my family ever find my body, and what sort of state is it? And all of this is going through my mind, and suddenly the soldier appeared over the hill. Not with a crowd, but with a woman wearing a burqa. And she came down, and she turned me around, and she started frisking me. And this is what the argument had been about. They had thought, is she carrying weapons? And has she got them concealed in her body? Well, you'd think that the most evil, brutal regime in the world would have just dragged me out, stripped me, and weapons or not. But he didn't. He went to find a woman to search me. He wasn't going to touch me. So she swung me round, and I had my back to the crowds of men who'd made me feel so scared. And she started frisking me. And I thought, oh, relief, I'm not going to be killed. Well, not immediately. And then I thought, those men behind me made me feel as though I was seconds away from a horrendous death. So I pulled away from the woman, and I turned back round at the men, and I picked up the hem of my dress. I was wearing trousers, and I said, I am not carrying any weapons, look. And I lifted my dress up like that. Well, the men took one sharp collective intake of breath, and then they slowly turned round and ran as though the devil was snapping at their heels. Of course, this was highly inappropriate behaviour in Afghanistan from a woman, and the lady wearing the burqa swung me back round and whacked me over the face just to remind me where I was, and you know, whatever, you know, that this is unacceptable. And then she finished her search, and I was bundled back into the car and driven off to what turned out to be the intelligence headquarters in Jalalabad. And so I was asked I was given a pencil and some paper and asked, you know, write your name, anything that will identify you and back up the story of who you say you are, and we will investigate. So I did all of this. And then the head of intelligence said, we are about to eat. His English wasn't great, but he could communicate, and he said, we are about to eat. Join us. And I said, I need to phone home. I need to use a telephone. And he said, this is impossible. And I said, well, in that case, I'm not eating. And I will not eat until I use the phone. And so what began was a hunger strike. Now you would think that the most evil, brutal regime in the world couldn't care less if I had decided not to eat, but it really upset them. Every morning, noon and night they would come into my room, they would lay out a cloth and put down a bowl of rice, a bowl of stew, they would have a jug of water in a bowl, they would wash my hands, and I'm thinking there's something weird going on here. You know, what don't they understand about their job description? You know, they're supposed to be brutal and evil, and yet, you know, I'm getting some very good table manners here. And they would go through all of this, and then I would go telephone, and they would shake their heads, and I would say, take it away. On the third day, they brought the cook, a wizened little old man who only had one tooth right in the middle of his mouth. And he tried, I think he was trying to smile anyway, but he looked quite bizarre with this one black tooth in the middle of his mouth, and he's pointing at the food, and the translator that they had given me said, this man wants to know why you won't eat his food, and he's begging me to, you know, eat this food. And then this great big tear rolled out of his eye down this leather-lined face as he's imploring me to eat the food, and I'm thinking, what? This is not what I'm expecting. You know, and this is not how an evil regime that hates women is supposed to behave. And there is the cook crying because I'm not eating his food. A few hours later, the doctor came. He had trained in Germany, but he knew a little bit of English, and he looked in my eyes, my ears, took my pulse, looked in my mouth, and started taking my blood pressure. And I thought, they do this, don't they, on death row in Texas? For some bizarre reason, you have to be fit and healthy before you're executed. And I thought, they're obviously going to execute me. And he took my blood pressure, something bothered him, so he took it again. And I said, you know, what's wrong? And he said, your blood pressure, it seems normal. And I said, no, it can't be normal. I suffer from high blood pressure. And he said, no, look, it's normal. And I said, well, there you go, 3 days with the Taliban and you've cured my blood pressure, thank you very much. So he didn't say anything more, he went off. The next day, Hamid came running into the room, which, by the way, had air conditioning. It was, by Afghan standards, it was quite a nice room. And he said, Madam Ridley, you are famous, look. And he pulled out the local Jalalabad newspaper, and there were 2 identical pictures of me on the front page. And although photographs were banned, there was, as I say, 2 identical headshots of me from Reuters. And then headlines going right from the top, right to the bottom, with a tiny little story. And I said, what does the headline say? And he said, the headline says, the Taliban have cured Yvonne Ridley's blood pressure and she's very happy. Not the catchiest of headlines, but there you go. So that was quite interesting. During the whole first 6 days, the scariest looking men I have ever seen would come into my it wouldn't be fair to call it a cell, but it would come into my room. They would sit down in a semicircle, and they had the biggest black beards and the biggest black turbans. What I didn't realise until later, in their society, the more pious you are, the bigger your turban. And so there they sat, these great big turbaned, black-bearded men. And they would sit in a semicircle, and then Hamid would sit there and I would sit there, And I would look at these men, and they would look at the ceiling, they would look out of the window, they would look on the floor, they would look anywhere but at me. And I thought, yes, this is typical. They are so guilty. They know that they're going to kill me, that they can't even look me in the eye. Of course, what I didn't realise, in their culture, they were showing me respect by not looking at me in the face. I totally misread the signals and thought, yeah, they're going to kill me. They're trying to show me respect. And the questioning for the first few days started off the same. Who is your father? Who is your father's father? Who are your uncles? Who are your great uncles? You know, write it all down. And I would write Mr. Alan Ridley for my father, and I didn't know the name of my grandfather. Now, I wouldn't have thought that this was such a big deal, but they wanted the name, and I just thought, I'll just put down Mr. Ridley, but I'll spell out the Mr. M-I-S-T-E-R, Mr. Ridley, for my father's father, as they called him. I honestly didn't know my grandfather's name. All I knew was that he was the black sheep of the family. He was only ever referred to as Old Man Ridley, and I don't know what on earth he'd done, but I didn't know his name. And I thought, I wonder how good Taliban intelligence is. Maybe they know his name. So I'm not going to lie, but I'll just put Mr. Ridley. After a few days, one of them noticed this, and he said through Hamid, the translator, "Why are you putting Mr. Ridley? What is the first name of your father's father?" And I looked at him and I thought, now do I bluff it and just say Michael or Stephen or David or, you know, some name, or do I just tell the truth? And I thought, just tell the truth. It's the one constant and it never changes, so it's easier just to tell the truth. So I said, I don't know what my father's name is. And he recoiled in horror, told the others. They all looked at me as though they'd found something nasty on the bottom of their shoe, and they got up and walked out. And I said to Hamid, you know, what is their problem? He said, you don't know your father's father. And I said, so what's the big deal? He said, we are trying to find out who you are. You don't even know who you are because you don't even know who your father's father is. And I said, of course I know who I am. You know, I'm my father's daughter. Get over it. And he was saying, no, this is a disgrace. You don't understand. He said, every one of those men can trace his line back to the companions. And I thought, who are the companions? You know, of course I was to find out later these were the first people in Islam, the pioneers of Islam. And he said, and me, he said, I can take my family right back to the Prophet Muhammad. And I thought, I really genuinely didn't know who this Muhammad was. You know, I was brought up in a white working class mining village where you were either a Protestant or a Catholic. There was nothing as exotic as Islam in our town. So I hadn't a clue who they were talking about, but they were just so disgusted that I couldn't trace my line back that they got up and walked out. Now Hamid was just about 20, 21 years old, but he had the misfortune of being able to speak English, Pashto and Urdu. And because of this, he was brought in as the translator to help translate my words with the Taliban. I had decided right from the beginning, this is, you know, the most evil, brutal regime in the world. They hate women. I'm not going to see the sunset tonight. I've got nothing to lose. I may as well be the prisoner from hell. And you might think it was a risky strategy to adopt, but that is exactly what I did. So for the first 6 days, I was rude, I swore at them, I spat at them, I threw things at them, I was cheeky and obnoxious, and Hamid used to say, please, please be respectful to these people, they terrify me and they should terrify you. I, on the other hand, just thought, they're going to kill me, what's the point of kissing the hand that slaps you when the end result is going to be the same? So I may as well go down and make it worth their while. And so I was the prisoner from hell. On the 6th day, Hamid came to see me. His mouth was so dry with fear he could hardly talk. And he said, you have a very, very important visitor. And he said, please, you must be respectful. This is a very high person. And I said, well, who is it? And he said, it doesn't matter, just please be respectful. And I'm thinking, is it Bin Laden? Is it Mullah Omar? You know, who is going to come through that door? And he was just saying, please, I urge you, be respectful. And he went out, and a few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Although I was the prisoner, I had the key. So I unlocked the door to my room, and there, standing in front of me, was a man who made my blood run cold. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I looked at him, and I had avoided talking about religion for 6 days, and there in front of me was a religious cleric. And furthermore, you know, everything that the Taliban wore was dusty and ripped and torn. This man was immaculate. He had an immaculate ivory gown. It went right down to the floor. You couldn't see his feet. Everything the Taliban wore was above the ankles. He had an ivory turban, a light brown beard, quite modest by Afghan standards. And there was something else about him, something that really surprised me. He had a light on his face, and I didn't know what this was, and it really freaked me out because the light was coming out of him. It wasn't shining on him. And I'm looking thinking, is he wearing makeup? You know, are they into face creams and I'm looking. I found out later that what I was seeing was the natural light which emanates from particularly pious people. It's called the Nur. And I have seen the Nur on people before, but not to this degree and intensity. And it, as I say, it really scared me because I was thinking, what is it? What is causing this light coming out of him? So I stood back and he went in and sat down, and Hamid sat in his usual place and I sat on the other end, and this man said to me, tell me, what is your religion? And I thought, oh, here we go, you know, I've avoided talking about this for 6 days and now he's asking me. And I said, I'm a Christian. He said, yes, but what sort of Christian? Are you a Roman Catholic? Or are you a Protestant? I said, I'm a Protestant from the Church of England. And he said, and what do you think of Islam? And in truth, I knew very little about Islam. What I did know, looking back now, was wholly incorrect anyway. And he said to me, what do you think of Islam? And I said, oh, it's a wonderful religion. I am very impressed with Islam, and I've watched your people practice it, and I'm so impressed. And then I said to him, I said, you know, I said, people are so much into their faith around here that they pray 5 times a day. I said, imagine that, 5 times a day. You do get into the habit of counting things when you're locked up. And And of course I didn't realise that the 5 prayers were obligatory. I had no idea. And he must have thought, you stupid woman, but he was far too polite to say anything. And he said, yes, he said, Islam is a beautiful religion. Oh, I said, I couldn't agree more. And again, I went off in praise of this great faith that I knew nothing about. And then when I finally finished, he was smiling and he said, so, you would like to convert? I thought, I've been trapped. I've been trapped. If I say, yes, I'll convert, you know, show me the moon and I'll sign on the dotted line, he'll say, you insincere, fickle woman, take her away and have her stoned. If I say, no, I'm not signing up to your religion, he'll say, how dare you insult Islam, take her away and have her stoned. You can see the theme that was running through my head constantly on this one. And I sat there for ages, and then I said, you know, I said, I can't make such a life-changing decision, but if you release me, I promise I will study your religion and read up on Islam. And he smiled and he didn't say another word, and he got up and he went out, and Hamid went running out after him. And then Hamid came back about 15 minutes later and he said, you're going home. You're going home on a Red Crescent plane. Well, I punched the air and congratulated myself on treating this this cleric so cleverly, I thought, and very soon I was put on this truck. My 2 guides were in the back of the truck, and they came in and said to me, you know, you're going to be okay. I had denied any knowledge about them at all, and so I didn't know if this was a trick or not, and I just said, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are, leave me alone. And they're saying, it's all right, they know all about us. And I said, I really don't know who you are. So I kept up this front that I didn't know who they were. And we drove past the airport, and then we all got out in what I can only describe as a grim third world prison. The guides went one way and I was taken down this corridor, and this prison door was opened, and I looked inside and I said, what? And two of the soldiers said, go in. I said, I'm not going in there. I said, look at it, it's squalid. I said, put me in a hotel and my newspaper will pay for it. And they said, no, you are a bad woman. You came to our country without a passport, without a visa. You must be punished. And I started shouting and cursing at them and refusing to go into this cell. Let's face it, anywhere else in the world, or a lot of places in the world, I would have been slapped around and kicked in and the door locked. But they didn't want to touch me. Just then, another cell door opened and 6 women wearing hijab came out, and one of them said, are you from the Red Cross? And I said, no, I'm not from the Red Cross. And I went, you speak English? And she said, well, I'm Australian, these 2 are American, and these 3 are German. And I said, oh my goodness, you're the Christians, you're the girls that have been, the missionaries who've been charged with trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. And they said yes, and so I started talking to them and said, look, they want me to go into this cell, I'm not going to go in, and will you tell them that they must put me up in a hotel? So they had a conversation, they spoke the language, and at the end of the conversation, Deanna, the Australian girl, said to me, come and stay in our cell for tonight, and then we can sort this out in the morning. And I thought, well, if I ever get out of this hellhole, then quite possibly I'll get an even better story, and everybody wants to know about these girls and how they are, and I'll find out, and I'll do interviews with all of them. So I said, yes, great, and so I walked into their cell, saw the bars on the windows and saw the rickety bunk beds and mattresses on the floor, and I just started crying. And I thought, I'm deeper into Afghanistan, I'm further into the country, further away from home. I'm just not going to get out of this place. The war is going to start, and you know, that this situation is looking really hopeless. And so I started to cry. And like any nicotine addict in a crisis, I reached for my cigarettes. And although smoking was banned under the Taliban, when they realised I smoked, they got me 200 American cigarettes. So I reached for the cigarettes, and I was about to light up, and I said, does anybody mind if I smoke? And one of the girls said, yes, this is a no smoking cell. And I thought, how have I ended up in the only no smoking cell in Asia? And one of them said, if you must smoke, go out into the courtyard. And I went, okay. And she said, we're about to hold a meeting. I said, a meeting? And she said, yes, we have 2 meetings a day. And I'm looking around thinking, what do they have to talk about twice a day? And then I realised this must be the escape committee. They're planning an escape. And I'm looking round, you know, for the stove and any signs of digging. And I said, can I stay in on this meeting? And yes, of course. And so I went, okay. And so I suddenly lost interest in the cigarettes. The tears dried. I wanted to hear their plans for escape. So I sat on the edge of the bunk bed, and the 6 of them sat in a circle on the concrete floor. And then they pulled out Bibles, and one of them started reading a passage from the Bible. And I'm chewing my knuckles thinking, oh my God, you know, they're being tried under Sharia law for trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. And here they are reading the Bible as loud as they can. Any minute now, a bunch of Taliban soldiers are going to come charging through that door, and there'll be collective punishment, and we'll all end up being whipped. And I was chewing away at my knuckles thinking, you know, what's going on here? 20 minutes later, they stopped reading the Bible, and then they pulled out pieces of paper which they unruffled, and they started singing. Now these weren't quiet, contemplative Victorian hymns. They were singing in a very robust evangelical, hallelujah, praise the Lord type singing. And at that point I went and got up and walked out and smoked 3 cigarettes off the trot. Just then there was the call to prayer. And I just thought, I've got lunatics on that side of the wall praying 5 times a day, fundamentalist Christians on this side of the wall doing their thing twice a day. And you know, my family will imagine that I'm being tortured, and you know, I feel as though I'm trapped in an Andy Warhol movie. And after the singing stopped, they then started praying, and again it wasn't the sort of quiet prayer that I had been used to, you know, sort of sitting quietly at the pews. It was full on shouting and Lord Jesus, and you know, really very robust. So this whole service that they had twice a day went on. You know, that was 2 hours every day, and it amazed me that the Taliban allowed them to do this, because, you know, this didn't tie in with some of the stories that we had been fed about life under the Taliban in Afghanistan. So after that, the next day I got up and one of the girls gave me a change of clothes, which was great, and I said, you know, where's the shower? Because I did in Jalalabad have a flush toilet and a shower, and the German girl, one of them, she said, come on out, and she took me to this hand pump, And she said, start pumping the water, and I'm pressing away this hand pump, and there was a zinc bucket, and eventually the water came out. And I said, this is amazing. I said, how do they heat it? And she started laughing, and she said, there's no hot water here. Welcome to Afghanistan, this is your shower. And when I asked about where the laundry was, again she laughed, and I was given a pumice stone and some soap flakes, and washed my dirty clothes with this pumice stone. I then hung up my washing on the washing line, and the prison governor came out, and he said to me, remove. And I said, remove what? He said, remove, pointing at my washing. And I said, it's my washing, it's drying in the sun. And he said, remove. And I said, no. And so he looked and he said, cover that. And he's pointing, and I said, cover my washing. I said, you've obviously never done the washing in your life. I said, how on earth will it dry in the sun if it's covered? I said, go away and don't bother me. And, I was still in prisoner of hell mode. And he wouldn't move, and he said, remove. And I said, no. And then he pointed at my underwear on the washing line. Well, I won't go into details, but we're not talking anything lacy and salacious. The girls will know this. We're talking big, comfortable Bridget Jones knickers. And he said, remove. And I said, if you don't like them, you remove them. And I thought he was going to implode on the spot. And he went away. And I thought, well, that's him sorted out. 15 minutes later, he returned, I kid you not, he returned with the foreign minister of Afghanistan. A man who should have been involved in shuttle diplomacy between America, Washington, and Islamabad, was suddenly embroiled in an argument over my knickers on the washing line. I couldn't believe it. There was the foreign minister, the equivalent of Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice standing there, and he said, Madam Ridley, please remove those items. And I said, it is my washing, this is the female wing of the prison, this is the female washing line, and if you two clear off, nobody is going to see my items on the washing line. And he said, it's not as simple as that. He said, the Taliban soldiers sleep above the female wing of the prison. If they look out of the window and they see those items, pointing at my knickknacks, he said, if they see those items, they will have impure thoughts. And I'm thinking, wow, and I'm looking at my big black knickers with newfound respect. And I said, there's a solution to this. He said, I knew you were a reasonable woman. He said, what is it? I said, tell your men not to look out of the window. He said, no, this is impossible. And the argument went on and on until the clothes had long dried. But this argument had started on the 6th of October, as it turned out, the day before the bombing actually started. And it shows you a little bit into their insight that although they were about to be bombed by the greatest superpower in the world, the foreign minister was trying to negotiate with me to get my knickers off the washing line. And I found out much later, this was their way of thinking. They couldn't do anything about America. If America was going to bomb, it would bomb. But they could do something about my underwear on the washing line. And so that's, they wanted to change that. And so that's why we had this bizarre conversation the night before the war started. There were many other strange incidents that happened, a few more clashes. I think it was that same day that I had had another argument with the foreign minister and his staff because I had refused to give my name to the prison governor. Everybody knew my name, but the prison governor wanted me to tell him. And it was just this ridiculous row that happened. And in the middle of this row, I don't know why I did it. I think it was maybe I was cracking up and being locked up. It was very difficult. I turned round and I spat at the foreign minister, and he walked off, and the female prison officers, they were women in the prison, they said, she will be flogged for this because you can't do this to such a high-ranking person. And about 15 minutes later, we heard the gates go, and somebody, one of the American girls came running in, and she said, Mr. Afghani, who was the second in command in the foreign ministry, she said, Mr. Afghani is coming in and Yvonne is going to be flogged. 3 of the Christians dropped down on their knees and grabbed my clothes and started praying furiously, Lord Jesus, don't let Yvonne feel any pain. And I'm standing there thinking, girls, you're not really helping the situation. And just then the door swung open, and it was Mr. Afghani, and he strode in very theatrically, and he had in his hand not a whip but a telephone, a mobile, one of those international satellite telephones. And he waved it around very theatrically, and then he said, today you can all call home. You can speak to your mothers, your fathers, your brothers, your sisters, your friends. Everybody today can call home. Everybody apart from her, the English woman. She's a very bad woman, and she spat at our foreign minister. And so I sat there, and this was my punishment. I sat there and watched them all ring home. I was very happy for them, but very sad for me, because I had been on hunger strike for 10 days, wanting to use the phone, and that was how the most evil, brutal regime in the world punished me, by me seeing all of this joy and unfolding as people ran home. As I say, there were many other similar stories, and that night I was removed from the cells with the girls, and I was taken out, and I thought, this is it, you know, I'm going to be shot, well, at least it'll end. And I was taken upstairs into the Taliban sleeping quarters and taken into the commander's room. He vacated the room, and I was told, tomorrow you will go home, inshallah. And I said, what is this inshallah you put on the end of every sentence? Because it never happens. And inshallah means God willing. And so, you know, they said, tomorrow you're going home. That night, the war started. It was terrifying, and you can hear a cruise missile from 20 miles away. These bombs were dropping within half a mile, quarter of a mile of the prison, and I just thought, if I ever get out of here, I'm going to join an anti-war movement. For some reason, and it probably sounds dotty or naive, although I had covered wars before, it was only at that moment when I was being bombed myself that I realised bombs do not discriminate. They can't tell man, woman, child, they can't tell nationalities, they can't tell military, civilian. It was terrifying. And then I thought, after the bombing stopped, I thought, well, the Afghans are going to know there's Westerners in this prison. They're just going to come and tear down the prison and tear us apart. That didn't happen. The next day, the Taliban did come. They drove me down to the border, and I was handed over to the Pakistani military. And as I was walking across no man's land, there were about 40 journalists shouting at me, saying, "How did the Taliban treat you?" And in truth, it was only the moment that I stepped off the people carrier and walked towards the media that I realised that I genuinely was going to be free. But even then I thought they could shoot me in the back. And as I walked towards the media and they said, "How did the Taliban treat you?" I'm walking along and I just thought that they treated me with courtesy and respect. And actually, I was the one who was awful. And I just thought, oh dear. And I wanted to turn round and go back and say to the Taliban, "Look guys, I'm really sorry if I upset you, you know, I was under a lot of stress, that isn't really me." But then I thought, if I turn round and go back, they'll say, "Oh my goodness, she's coming back," and then they probably would have shot me. So I continued walking, and when I got to them, I said they treated me with courtesy and respect. It is not what anyone wanted to hear. The war had started. You can't drop bombs on nice people, can you? And nobody wanted to hear that I had been treated with courtesy and respect. What they wanted to hear was that I had been tortured, raped, sodomized, electrocuted, waterboarded. In fact, everything that happened subsequently in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, that's what they expected, which often prompts me to say, and sometimes it's not popular, but it's the truth, thank God I was captured by the most evil, brutal regime in the world and not by the Americans, is all I can say. I did keep my promise, and I did study Islam and look into it, and what started out as a promise and an academic exercise did turn into, for me, a spiritual journey, and I embraced Islam. About 2 years later, which again wasn't a very popular decision as far as some people were concerned. But you know, I always had that core belief in God, and as I tell people, I'm still praying to the same God, I still hold the same belief, and you know, I've just got a different methodology now. My little black dress is a big black dress, and I dress more modestly, but I'm still essentially the same person. That's my story. You've been incredibly attentive, and so if there are any questions that any of you have, please by all means ask them. I hope you've enjoyed hearing my story as much as I have telling it, and quite often people come away thinking, gosh, we feel sorry for the Taliban. Anyway, so there it is. Thank you very much for being so attentive.
Should we have a little break and then we can do
yes,
question and answers?
Yeah.
Awesome.